Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nick Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Make sure that you are following and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, and share this episode with your family and friends because I got two great guests coming on. I have Troy Olson and Gavin Wax, authors of the Emerging Populist Majority. Gavin's been on the show before. Troy's a first-timer. How are you guys?
Doing great.
Doing great.
And joining you to discuss this new book that we just published.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pleasure. Congratulations on the book. And so I'll start with Troy. Why did you decide to write this book?
A couple of reasons. One, I was in part thinking for a while about sort of how we got to this political moment was sort of the impetus. So it started with a lot of research and sort of writing on a Word document. And then at some point, I thought I was onto something that might make a compelling a narrative and study and kind of introduce a bit of a new thesis into the ether. So I grabbed Gavin and I pitched doing a book together, which eventually became, at the time, it was called the Emerging American Majority, with the sort of title referring to the Republican Party growing into a multi-racial coalition with realigning Hispanics, Asian Americans, and to an extent Black men as well. And then Gavin, after maybe a few weeks in, said it should be called the Emerging Populist Majority. I think that was a great change because that's also really what we're talking about, probably even more so what we're talking about, which is a social class realignment that has been in the works for a long time. And so it does favor, obviously, one political party, but it wasn't a foregone conclusion. It could have, in theory, favored either political party. So that was kind of the origins of the book and collaborating with Gavin on it.
And Gavin, when did you first notice this shift where we were saying, it used to be that the Republicans, it was all about the corporate world and the big corporate donors. And then next thing you know, the corporate world's giving the money to the Democrats and you're seeing blue collar workers supporting Republicans. When did you notice that shift?
I mean, at a personal level, I certainly started to notice things change, I guess, even back in 2014, 2015, 2016, when I was first getting involved on the ground locally in politics, particularly in Queens and even parts of Long Island. I noticed, really the Republican Party was starting to change. A lot of the people that I was interacting with in the grassroots at these different clubs, at these different meetings, they really were these blue collar, kind of salt of the earth type individuals. And they were talking about things, economics, they were talking about the border, they were talking about issues that really were not at the forefront of most of the Republican establishment. And I think really with the ascendancy of President Trump starting in 2015 and culminating in 2016, we really saw a shift that finally made sense, a shift that was really, catching up to really where the grassroots was moving. And it just sort of seemed like the people that really been guiding the Republican Party for many, many years were extremely out of touch. Their rhetoric was dated, and they were, pushing out this policy agenda that really wasn't to the benefit of their actual constituents and voters. It was actually basically supporting a select few in the donor class and the consultant class. And it was sort of the same type of policies that many in the Democrat side, the Democrat establishment, were actually supporting. It was the globalization, it was the open borders, it was the unimpeded free trade. A lot of these things that President Trump had been talking about for decades, they were largely ignored by the establishments of both parties. And finally, something came to a head and it changed.
Yeah, well, to me, I always found it amazing because they despise the former president so much, yet they don't realize that their failures to represent the American people are directly what led to him becoming president of the United States in 2017 and potentially becoming president again. Now, if you listen to the media, if you listen to a lot of the establishment Republicans, they're constantly berating populism and populists. Why do you think that is?
Troy?
Yeah, I'll take this. I think it does come down to social class. The simplest word for it is snobbery. But I also think there's a quite a bit of professional embarrassment going on. For years, they had this theory of the case for how the Republican Party was going to become more competitive. They even wrote in 2012, after Romney's loss, there was this whole postmortem about what needs to happen. And President Trump has largely delivered on everything that they wanted to have happen, and they can't stand it because it wasn't on their terms. It wasn't with them in charge. It wasn't their leadership, and it wasn't with, most importantly, their ideas. Their ideas are decidedly different. Their ideas for how they were going to realign people were different and inaccurate. And then President Trump is decidedly different than the Republican establishment figure of yesteryear, and he has tapped into something that was already there on issues of trade and immigration and forever war, and these are the issues of globalization. At the end of the day, an indictment on the philosophy of globalism, which really did run through the establishments of both parties.
And the interesting thing that I saw with the Trump administration, President Trump is not your regular conservative. I mean, nobody would actually describe him as a conservative. He wouldn't describe himself, particularly before he even jumped into 2016, as a conservative. And yet he actually was probably one of the most conservative presidents that we've ever had as we look at the policies. He had an enormous amount of success when it came to policies. And I think that it's safe to say that the world was much more stable as him as president. So when you look at the failures within the Democrat Party and you look at the current Republican Party, what's lacking?
Well, quite a bit. I want to echo first a few points that Troy made on your first question. I certainly think a lot of it is this sort of class snobbery, classicist snobbery that's going on, the disdain for the populist movement, the disdain for the working man. I also think in general they view the populist movement as a real threat, and it's ascendant globally. It's changing the political landscape, not just in the United States, but through most of Europe and the world, Latin America. It comes in different shapes and sizes, but it's largely a movement that's counter elites, counter elitism. And the elites of this country and the broader Western world are completely disconnected from the people that they represent. They're completely out of touch. And as a result, the populist movement worldwide is extremely potent right now, and it's securing political and electoral victories. And it's really a thorn in the side to the established order, whether it's the established order in politics or media or finance or corporate America or all these major institutions. So there's a lot of disdain for it. And it's a term that's really encapsulating this broad coalition of discontents against a failing status quo, which actually bleeds into your next question in regards to conservatism and the movement. I mean, I think the reason Trump didn't actually use the term for a while, and many others have stopped using the term, is because there's nothing left to conserve. We need something that's actually active. We need something against the system, against the status quo, maybe a return to things how they once were, make America great again. That's not necessarily a conservative statement. That's more of a populist statement. It's a return to something from the past that we once had as a country, and is what the parties are missing. I mean, the parties are missing leadership. They're missing visionaries, a vision, cohesion. I give the radical left some more credit when it's due, and I give some of the left wing in general more credit. They're far more ruthless. They're far more ruthless political operators. They're willing to use all the tools at their disposal to advance their own ends, and they're quite a ruthless bunch. And I respect that Machiavellian nature. I only wish our side fought for keeps as much as their side did. But I could speak to the problems on our side. Our side and our leadership and our party, and then both parties, but especially the Republican Party, are largely captured by donors, special interests, corporate interests, et cetera. They're not responsive to the base. I mean, and this is playing out across the Western world. You see routinely polls and surveys and other data points talking about how people feel about mass migration, how people feel about a variety of social and cultural issues. And the response from the elites, the response from party leadership, whether it's in the United States, the United Kingdom, or in continental Europe, it's always to dismiss them and to continue marching on with their vision of the world, which is a vision of open borders, a vision of corporate dominance, a vision of woke social cultural Marxism, eradicating cultures, eradicating national identities. It's happening out at the micro level. It's happening at the macro level. And basically, the party leadership seems content to move along with it. And if anything, the best you're going to get out of most traditional establishment Republicans is this managed decline. They want to keep this decline just at a slower pace compared to those crazy Democrats who want to do it much faster. So I think that's really a crux of a lot of problems. It's a mentality problem. It's a It's an incentive problem. It's a problem structurally with how the party is arranged and governed and elected in terms of the party officials. And these are issues that are going to be overcome over time. These things don't happen overnight. This emerging populist majority is not a tomorrow thing. It's a generational thing. It's something that's moving and has been moving in a certain direction. But politics is about the long game. This is a generational outlook. This is not something that happens overnight. If you look at some of the last major changes, let's stick with the Republican Party, just for comparison's sake. You look at the change in the party that it went from, say, the 1950s and 60s to the 1980s and 90s. Maybe it doesn't seem like a big change in comparison, but going from a party dominated by the Northeastern establishment, the Rockefellers of the world, to a party that was much more in line with the vision of, say, Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, the sort of fusionist National Review style conservatives. That was a process that took 20 something years, 25 years, and it still was trickling even into the 90s and early 2000s. We're looking at a very similar trend. Maybe some of it's expedited due to technology, social media, and the force of character that is Donald Trump. But this emerging populist majority is certainly ascendant, and it's certainly going to replace a lot of the governing mechanisms within the Republican Party, and maybe on the left wing to a degree within the Democrat Party, if we can help.
And I think explaining and exploring those changes are really important so that the audience understands. So we're going to take that up when we get back from this quick break. Everyone hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Gavin, Troy, before we get into the changes that are happening within the Republican Party, Troy, I want to get your thoughts on what do you want to be the biggest takeaway after people read this book?
One, I hope they look at American political history quite a bit differently than maybe what they were taught. Not even so much in schools, but what they would hear from peers and from culture and from the media. These calming things that we're here, because ever since I was a kid, I've been hearing basically some version of the same thing, that the Democratic Party will be the party of the future because emerging demographics and there's a straight line to the future and nothing will change there, so they'll come to dominate. And now that, of course, is sort of a lazy statement, but that's exactly kind of what the cultural bias was. That was largely a misinterpretation of a lot of things. And in part, we are responding to a little bit a book from 2002, 2003, The Emerging Democratic Majority. But even that book, the authors of that book say, no, we had major caveats to that. So it's not even, we're more so responding to the cultural laziness of the last couple of decades that had this idea that the Democratic Party was the party of the future because of emerging demographics. And what has happened is the Democratic Party is probably, while the Republican Party has, of course, its issues, the Democratic Party is weaker than it's been in 50, 60, 70 years. It's always been basically falling from its FDR LBJ peak, but its aspirations have never really left that peak. And that, I think, is kind of one of the tensions within American politics today. And because if you are a Democrat who has heard that your whole life, you're probably very frustrated that this hasn't materialized by now. Donald Trump is probably not just a phenomenon, but a shocking a blow to your system. And you thought you were getting a completely different future. And so that's kind of what it's responding to. And it's also disagreeing with some of the commonly held notions of American political history. And so that's a lot of new info and a lot of counter narratives is what I hope people draw from it. And it is just the beginning of a larger narrative that will unfold. Just like Gavin said, the Emerging Populist Majority is a generational story. It did precede Donald Trump. He has understood it and grabbed it better, more than anyone. But it will also, there is a story that will unfold after him that I think you'll see develop from his core supporters and people that are continuing to sort of have their finger on the pulse of what the American middle and working class family and a person has in their mind. Because, it really is a late hour for this country. One thing that was said in this book is, winning elections is merely the beginning. That's, to turning a society around, a civilization around. And the crisis that this book is in part describing today is a civilizational one. And I think that calls for a populist movement that is in fusion with return to tradition, rather than what Gavin said, what are we conserving? What is left to conserve? Certainly not these institutions that people have very, very low trust in at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we look at this new demographic change that's going on within the political parties themselves, you guys are actually part of this, right? I mean, Gavin, when you took over the New York Young Republican Club, that was a club that was almost dead. It wasn't really even functioning at that point. And when you took it over, how many members were there and how many members are there today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see the club as a microcosm for a lot of the things we're discussing, particularly here in New York, which I think is also at the front lines of this realignment. We took over the club. It was a a rhino moderate liberal Republican club, very much a Cheney Bush type of club, Jeb Bush type of club, and they had I think something like 40 something members, maybe. That's maybe exaggerating it. It was on its last leg as an institution that went back over 100 years. Now today we're over 1,200 members. We just had a gala at Cipriani Wall Street with President Trump, attended by over 1,000 people. So I think the growth of the club has sort of validated a lot of the ideological points that myself and Troy and myself share, and it's also validated a bunch of the just electoral points that we've made in terms of the realignment in this country. I think there's been a realignment even in a place like New York and Island and the outer boroughs, the state as a whole. We've seen a shift to the right. We've seen a changing Republican coalition, even here in New York City. The old coalition of the Silk Stocking District on the Upper East Side. Once a bastion of the Republican Party, a bastion of liberal republicanism, up until honestly the early 2000s. That's been replaced by a party that's largely dominated in the outer boroughs. Troy works for a council member who represents a realigned district in South Brooklyn. I'm from a part of Northeast Queens that is now represented by a friend of ours, Nick, Vicky Palladino, a stalwart Republican, I would argue very much a populist in the city council. So these changes and trends, they were reflected both in the club, they were reflected in the political environment surrounding the club here in New York. And if you look at even the national movement, the national trends, a lot of these demographic cohorts that have been shifting, whether it's working class Hispanics, working class whites that Troy alluded to earlier, you see that same thing happening in places like New York. Some of the biggest shifts to the right by some of these demographic cohorts happened in New York, it happened in the Rio Grande Valley. These were changes that happened because of Trump coming from Queens, Trump being a New Yorker himself. I think makes it even more of a salient point about how this movement in many ways is being shaped by places like New York. Troy often brings up a point that it's almost like a reverse FDR coalition. FDR's coalition was largely based in the cities and the rural America, the rurals, and this is the same kind of reverse FDR coalition. You're running up the numbers in rural America. You've lost ground in the suburbs, some of the more traditional Republican areas, the silk stocking suburbs, if you will. And we've made up ground in some, urban areas on the margins, of course, not winning outright majorities, but electoral math is funny that way. It's the scale of things. You have a large city, you're winning it by 33%. That's the number you need for a statewide or nationwide victory. We saw that play out in the electoral college map in places like Pennsylvania, with the vote being run up in places like South Philadelphia, and that's going to play out hopefully in New York State. We almost saw it with Lee Zeldin. He got almost 30-something% or just a little bit above that in New York City, and we saw a statewide total around 47%. Let's say you move the numbers by 3 points in New York City, all of a sudden you have a governor, Lee Zeldin, you have a Republican governor, and maybe even, who knows, a Republican Senate chamber in a place like New York. So things happen very quickly. They happen very fast sometimes. Politics is an interesting game, but if you have a thesis, if you have an underlying philosophy to it, you can really call these elections almost to a T.
Yeah, absolutely. And people don't realize in politics is all about incremental gains. It's not like you really see this huge jump from election to election, but if you keep on building on momentum, that's when you start to see victories. Now, my biggest problem, and Gavin, you and I have spoken about this it's the Republican apparatus as a whole, where they largely ignore communities. And so on the television screens, I'm witnessing ordinary residents in Chicago and New York and Baltimore holding press conferences, screaming about all the illegal immigrants coming to the area and what's going on. And in every one of those press conferences, the one thing I don't see is a Republican representative behind them screaming that we're listening to you and we hear your complaints and give us a chance and see if we could do better. You haven't voted for us in 50, 60, 100 years in certain cases, and so give us a chance. Why has the Republican Party as a whole, as an apparatus, refused to go into these communities, speak to these people? Because, and Troy, jump in here. One of the concerning aspects is when we do look at the city council election of last year, what was it? 7% of New Yorkers turned out to vote. Those eligible. I mean, that's pathetic. That is horrendous. But it means that there's a couple million voters that are gettable.
Absolutely. Not just in New York City. New York City might be an egregious example of it, but in urban America generally, the Republican Party has been surging back a bit. But it's not necessarily because of anything the leadership apparatuses are doing. I think it is grassroots and citizen involvement. And that's a great thing for energy. But one thing you get with grassroots movements sometimes is there may not be your go-to expert at how to do this stuff because everyone's sort of newly involved in politics. So there are some growing pains. And that's why I think institutions like what Gavin's done with his leadership at the New York Young Republican Club and actually figuring these things out and hosting events and being generous with sharing info and sharing strategy and tactics and in general participating in party building is so vital. So at the end of the day, I think New York City is on its way back. It's not happening as fast as Gavin and I would like, but it is happening.
I don't think it's happening as fast as most people would like.
No, absolutely not. Because at the end of the day, doubling the city council is nice, but it's got to double 3-4 more times. And at the end of the day, the city is declining at such a rate that there's so much potential given how few people are voting. So absolutely, I was disappointed in the 23 cycle, just as you are, and 21 was a pretty good cycle, but 23 was disappointing, and I chalked that up to the fact that there wasn't it was just the council races, and it's just very hard to recruit enough good candidates that are going to do the hard work. It's hard to ask someone to run for office as a Republican in a major city. It is a huge sacrifice of time, and it takes a lot of work to run a major city campaign. You can't, I'm from a small town in Minnesota, and the tactics that you do to turn out the vote there versus here are very
welcome to New York.
You can do. With 10, I haven't lived in a small town in like 15 years now, but you can go door to door to door, and you generally know that people are going to vote. Here, I call it the flag knock. The only friendlies I know for sure are I see an American flag, I'm going to go up to that door, and I know that I'm going to get a friendly door. And that's really what it is in New York City now, and that's probably applicable to Chicago or Minneapolis now too. And that's really sad, but it also is the emerging populist majority against sort of who's actually in charge, the elite establishment, who of course have adopted cultural Marxism and wokeism or whatever you want to call it, because it's expedient for them to do so, and it doesn't cost them anything.
That's certainly a problem. And Gavin, something that your organization does very well, the New York Young Republican Club, is that you actually mobilize. You actually go out on the ground. And I want to talk to you about the importance of that when we get back from this quick break. So everyone, hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. So, Gavin, before the break, we were talking about the mobilization. I wanted to get into the importance of getting on the ground and actually getting in touch with people, door-to-door, knocking, all these different types of campaigns to bring in more Republicans, bring in more registered voters. When you look at it, Republicans do a really good job at complaining. I mean, they're amazing when it comes to complaining. But very few of them actually volunteer. They don't put on the boots. They don't put in the work and the time that's necessary to cultivate a growing Republican Party. How important is it for ordinary people to get involved, to join these clubs, to volunteer for candidates and help them out? How important is that?
No, it's a great point. Listen, we built out a holistic organization because we know that if you're going to try to get free labor out of people, free volunteer hours, you need to have something that they feel like they're a part of. You need to do events, you need to do socials, you need to have the fun if you're going to expect them to come out and do all the hard work, knocking doors, phone banking, canvassing, handing out lit, you name it. That's a lot of labor, that's a lot of time. Most Republicans, they're working full time. We don't necessarily have the luxury of relying on unions or relying on people that are basically living off patronage through the system, through welfare, whatever it is. Our
Or
people
the grant funding that the government's providing to all these far left
nonprofit. Yeah,
nonprofit
correct.
organizations that are really nothing more than Democrat fronts.
Correct. We're at an infrastructure disadvantage, but that's why, as Troy said, we really need to do more community building, more party building. People laughed at Obama, being a community organizer, but the left understands you build these types of structures up block by block. You really create a very potent political machine. And that's what they have. They have political machines. They have very sophisticated political machinery, especially in urban America, especially in the city. And when you talk about these low turnout elections, these low enthusiasm elections, their machine wins their races. They get candidates out, and even in districts that we should be winning. And even what Troy said, we have a Republican Party that has, for the most part, been falling kind of into some wins. A lot of the wins that they've had recently, especially even in New York, have almost been by accident, not through any sort of deliberate action. And many times, we've gotten candidates in there who have been less than or have been subpar, to put it mildly. But this is part of the growing pains, and I would hope the Republican Party in New York and across the country starts to wake up, starts to understand that there are trends and dynamics at play at the local level that could work in their favor if they organize and they get their heads together and they're willing to work with the base, the grassroots, who may be more to their right, who may be more MAGA, who may be more America First, Trumpian, however you want to describe it. They should put aside their petty political squabbles and understand that the party is changing. And if they lean into it, if they embrace it, they could actually see electoral windfalls, and we could start to actually win more seats. And that's a cascade effect. You talk about investing, compound interest, all that. Well, you start compounding politically when you get one member of the city council, all of a sudden now you have 10, 15 staff members, they have 10, 15 families. All of a sudden you're building out a support network, you get someone else elected, you're on the ballot with a few more candidates, people that are coming out for you, they're coming out for other Republicans. So you slowly start to see the snowball effect when you start getting a few seats picked up. So that's why, even if you're not a majority in a place like the city council, winning a few seats is critical. In a place like the city council, it's a good ROI. I said this recently at a South Brooklyn Republican Club event. These members of the city council, maybe they're not a majority on the council, but in their district, they operate like a little mini mayor, and they control a lot of appointments. They control a lot of funding. They have a lot of say, and they don't need necessarily a legislative majority to really make a difference. So that's the party building that's going on in New York. I think, frankly speaking, the Democrats, you referenced the town halls, they don't care anymore. They're past persuasion politics, the Democrat machine and establishment. They're just going to import new voters. They're going to import new voters from abroad, and they're going to brainwash your kids to vote for them no matter what. I mean, they're post-political. I mean, you see some of these areas the Democrats control. There's no political dynamic. The typical political equation that you would run to understand the dynamics don't apply there. It's like post-tribal. It's post-political. They're just voting Democrat no matter what, either because they've been imported to do so or they've been brainwashed to do so, and then they have the rest are made up by their political machinery. So as long as the gears of that machine works, that system of one-party dominance will continue. Then on the other hand, the Republicans, you have this sort of arrogance and snobbery that basically says, well, the people that aren't voting Democrat have nowhere else to vote. So they're going to have to vote for us. They're going to have to put up with us. And even if we suck, even if we don't deliver, even if we're wishy-washy, milquetoast weak, whatever, you got nowhere else to go, buddy. So you better vote for GOP no matter what, because if you don't, it's only going to get worse with them, and it'll just be a little less worse with us. So sometimes the two-party system really rears its ugly head, and it creates a lot of apathy. And, that ties into the apathy you see in New York City, for example, 7%. Atrocious. It's funny. The more Democrat an area is, the less democracy you actually see. More one party, less voting. I mean, that's the Democrats' democracy in action. And then you look at all the opinion polls and things when voters across the aisle are against women and men's sports, when they're against the open border, when they're against offshoring jobs. Doesn't matter if there's a 60%. 65% silent majority that support those things. Democracy is whatever the 10, 15% of the population wants, that's what they're going to get. So we're living in funny times, but I think push is finally coming to shove. And I think we're seeing a pushback. I think we're seeing the fruits of this realignment. And I think going into 2024 with November, I'm very optimistic. I know Troy's very optimistic. There's a lot of things that are working our way. And if things continue this way, we could be in for a very historic win come November at the presidential level, which could have massive implications down ballot.
And that's why everyone needs to check out the Emerging Populist Majority. And we're going to have links up at the P.A.S. report to the book and to the New York Young Republican Club. Gavin, Troy, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and speak to the audience.
Thank you for having us. It was a great discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.